Our next speaker is William Pace. He's going to talk to us about civil society engagement in global governance. I should, just by way of introducing him, tell you that I became a world federalist very late in my life. I'm a new recruit. And one of the reasons, well, no, the reason I joined the World Federalists was because of Bill Pace. He doesn't know that, but that is the truth. He is the executive director of the World Federalist Movement and the Institute for Global Governance, Global Policy, and he was amongst a group of young Turks, including in Canada a fellow named Fergus Watt, who moved into the World Federalist Movement, and they saw it as the great potential in it because of its history and background and membership. And they decided that it needed to be rejuvenated, and they decided that it had to move from talk to action. So what he did in the last few years, he has been the convener of the coalition of the International Criminal Court, which brought about the first and only institutional change in the international system since the founding of the UN. He then went on to be the co-founder of the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect, R2P. These are two monumental achievements. He has more than 1,000 people, NGOs in his networks, and most recently, he has also brought to a fairly successful conclusion the campaign of 1 for 7 billion, that is, trying to get a more legitimately appointed Secretary General for the United Nations. Bill Pace.
And does this have to stay open, this computer, or can I can close it? Okay, good. Well, as you will see in your book, and I hope you all have gotten the book, Joe Schwartzberg starts with 2 quotes from Einstein. The splitting of the atom has changed everything save our mode of thinking, and thus we drift towards unparalleled catastrophe. And the second quote, henceforth, every nation's foreign policy must be judged at every point by one consideration. Does it lead us to a world of law and order, or does it lead us back to anarchy and death? Of course, Einstein died in 1955, and these were quotes from the late 1940s. I also was basically became a World Federalist because of Albert Einstein. I was resisting the draft in the United States for the Vietnam War, but I would have fought in World War II, so I was struggling with the issue of war and found a book called Einstein on Peace, which was a 500-page documentary of Einstein's efforts and struggle with this question from 1914 to 1955 when he died, and it's still, for me, one of the great peace biographies of the last century. I want to thank the Trust and Nancy and all of the presenters. I think this is an important conference. I very much appreciated the description, Joe, of your life in the book. I hear we've known each other for decades, and I didn't know much of that story, and it's fascinating and welcome. I also think that your presentation yesterday for opening the session was extraordinary, and look forward to both the audio and the written version. I have been a anti-war, peace, environment activist, a human rights activist, an international democracy activist since college in the 1960s. It was, however, 25 years later until I came to work for peace and justice and international democracy at the international level. And this occurred at the end of the 1980s. I'm from the Rocky Mountains region of the United States. Spent a lot of time in Denver. When I'd go to Denver City Council meetings, there would be usually 50 lobbyists working for mostly real estate and business interests, and then there would be, out of that, 5 of us that were working for civil rights or historic preservation or education issues, social welfare issues. We went to the Colorado State Capitol. In those days, 500 lobbyists. Again, 90% were for business and industry, and 10% working on social welfare issues. Went to Washington. In those days, 10,000. Now I think it's 100,000. 10,000, the same statistics. Went to the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1988 and 89, and there were 6 of us in the legal committee. 6. If you go to the legal committee this afternoon, there'll be 5 or 6. So I was astounded when I learned the ability of individuals to impact the processes of governance at the UN. And it, as I said, here 25 years later, remains the same situation. And there's some good reasons for it. But it also, for youth, to say that you can have an impact at the international level that I think you cannot realize from the perspective of even the local community or state community or national community. I'm going to speak bluntly and in broad strokes because of the limitations of time and the breadth of issues that I want to raise. As Charlotte said, I do think that we are at a very interesting point in 2015, and there are best of worlds and worst of worlds forces occurring simultaneously. I'm the General Secretary of the World Federalist Movement and the Institute for Global Policy. It is an international movement begun in 1947. We have 30 or so national and associated member organizations around the world. Some of our biggest projects, you've heard some about them today, the UN Parliamentary Assembly, the Coalition for the International Criminal Court, which includes now about 3,000 non-governmental organizations in 150 countries, the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect. We host the Office of the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, a global network on conflict prevention. You've just heard mention our campaign on 1 for 7 billion to, after 69 years, change the terrible procedures that are employed to appoint the Secretary General of the United Nations. And we believe that we have a very good chance with the General Assembly and with elected members of the Council and one of the permanent members of the Council, the UK, in changing those procedures for the appointment next year. We host the Center for Development of International Law, the NGO Working Group on the Security Council. We were a leader in the GEAR campaign, the campaign that helped integrate the different agencies and programs on women's issues into UN Women. We are a leader in the effort on the veto restraint. There's 2 processes. Mexico and France have a political declaration on the P5 restraining their veto, and 27 countries of a group called ACT are calling for all member states to endorse a code of conduct on restraint of the veto when it affects the prevention or blocking action to prevent war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Some of you were at the Hague Appeal for Peace. We still have that in our office, mostly in an archival state. But it's a breadth of projects, and that isn't even inclusive. But and I have three wonderful staff here with me today: Justine and Alex and Abby, who work on the Security Council, the 1 for 7 billion. We host the Center for UN Reform Education in our office, also, and our International Democratic Governance Program. To address the issue Joe asked today on the civil society, I'm going to talk briefly about the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. World Federalist, by its different names over the last many decades, began literally in 1948 in the early efforts in the General Assembly to create a permanent court to succeed the military tribunals of Nuremberg and Tokyo. And we worked on it all in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, and 80s. And then one of our supporters, who had become the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, A.N.R. Robinson, was able to reintroduce the issue in 1989 into the General Assembly. And of course, because he linked it also to drug trafficking and terrorism, the US and UK couldn't kill it, but they did send it to their burial ground, the Sixth Committee, the Legal Committee of the General Assembly, and they sent it to the Law Commission of the General Assembly, which is kind of a deeper burial ground for issues. We had at our small office in New York, and we've been organized in The Hague and Amsterdam since 1950, and in New York since about 1965, with small offices. But we had a small network, and then when the draft treaty came out of the Law Commission in 1994, Amnesty International wrote and asked us to organize a meeting, and they invited a bunch of groups, and 25 organizations started the Coalition for the International Criminal Court in February of 1995. By the time we got to Rome, we had 800 member organizations, and 535 of us were in Rome at various times for the treaty conference. It was a spectacular success. We got, as John was saying, one of the strongest, perhaps the strongest advance in international law in the last century, and that's a major statement to make. It is a court that is independent. It's not controlled by the Security Council. It is not controlled by the veto. It is an independent prosecutor, independent judges, automatic jurisdiction. It is a supranational court for the 123 governments that have ratified the Rome Statute and implemented the treaty in national legislation. There are no reservations. There's no immunity. There's a ability of victims to participate and to receive reparations. Gender crimes have been defined much further than they badly were in the Geneva Conventions, etc. It is an extraordinary treaty. And it was a treaty that was successful as a partnership between global civil society and governments, and mainly the small and mid-sized democracies. And as Andreas was just saying, with the coming down of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, it turned out that democracy had grown much faster and more prevalent around the world than was realized. And in the vacuum of this Cold War ending without the major powers really orchestrating it or even predicting it, the small and mid-sized powers and the UN filled the vacuum. And that's why, in part, you had this enormous activity in the 1990s on trying to bring reforms and improvements in the international legal order. There was a like-minded group of governments, about 8 or 9, that that got together early on. This also, I should say, was the era of Mandela and the impact he had on that continent while from his time of his release till his death, which has tragically receded dramatically since his death. But you had 6 or 7 countries coming together. It grew, and by the time the preparatory meetings went to the Rome Treaty Conference, it was 70 countries. And so it was a coalition of NGOs from the South and the North and across a whole spectrum of mandates and themes, working together with a network of governments from the South and the North. And they stood up to the major powers and decided by a vote of 120 yes and 7 no, a vote that was insisted upon by the United States, which voted no, to ratify or to accept this treaty, which, like law of the sea, was supposed to take 25 years to ratify and would give time for the U.S. to amend, but instead 3 years, 8 months later, 66 countries had ratified the treaty. It entered into force, and since 1 July 2002. And it was not, again, supposed to have any cases, but it is just overwhelmed with work and challenges. It also, like any international organization, has its own internal problems and weaknesses, but it is a very important development for peace and the rule of law and international affairs. And I saw that the prosecutor went to the judges and is opening a case on the crimes committed in Georgia in 2008. That was announced last Friday. And as Andreas was saying, I think a lot of it in looking, well, the next statement is that there is no way we could get the International Criminal Court Treaty agreed to now. The African governments would not agree to no immunity. Most governments would not want to have no reservations. The gender laws would not be supported. The automatic jurisdiction wouldn't be supported. The independent prosecutor wouldn't be supported, etc. So it was a moment in time and a tipping point, but also that tipping point disappeared after a few years, and I don't think has resurrected, and I'm not sure any of the major achievements in international law of the last 70 years would have as easy a time or could be renewed in an intergovernmental process under the current divisions geopolitically. Now want to take a second on the Security Council reform, because that is a major block on anything happening. And the major focus, if you say Security Council reform at the UN and Google it, well, one, you'll see the Center for UN Reform come up first. And Jim Paul's organization, Global Policy Forum, coming up, et cetera. So it's just a few of us that are monitoring. But what they're really talking is about expansion. And as when you saw Ramesh Thakur's very, very good preface to Joe's book, you see throughout his introduction and preface a focus on that you're not going to have any reform until the emerging powers correct the imbalance that was agreed to in 1945 when the 5 permanent members got their permanent membership and the veto. So that's what's going on in the Security Council reform or UN reform, is are we going to expand the membership of permanent members on the council or not? Then other governments would like to see additional seats for non-permanent members of the council. There's a G4, Germany, Japan, Brazil, and India that are taking the lead in this. And then South Africa has often been active in the framework of this and with the BRICS, et cetera. The African Union says they want 2 permanent seats with a veto, but they want the AU to rotate those, which is an explanation. Now, to amend the UN Charter requires a 2/3 vote of all the member states in the General Assembly, and then 2/3 of all of those states' parliaments or governments have to ratify the amendment, including all 5 of the permanent members with a veto. So the prospects of actually getting additional permanent seats on the Security Council are enormously difficult and extremely, I think, unlikely. However, there's only a very few countries who say, but the permanent membership is the problem, not the solution. We shouldn't be adding more permanent members. We should be trying to fix the imbalances now. But unfortunately, there's only 12 of those countries in the United for Consensus group. Canada is one of those countries. The rest of them are saying, our governments are saying, no, 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 we want to expand both in permanent seats and non-permanent seats. The real stressful paradox is that they want to do that, but they don't want anyone from their region to become the new permanent seat. So Brazil wants it in South America, but you don't really have the support for Brazil to become a permanent member from Chile, Argentina, Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, etc. India wants it, but it might cause World War III with Pakistan and some of the other countries. Japan wants it, but all sorts of countries in Asia don't want Japan to become a permanent member. And in Africa, it mostly talked about South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, but Egypt's kind of been off the table now for the last 5 years. But again, the East Africans and West Africans and others really don't want to create 2 hegemons in Africa, etc. But they won't say, then let's move away from more permanent members, because to say that means that we're going to be stuck with the 1945 geopolitical agreement. That's the dilemma. And one of the things that I think is very important is that civil society needs to try and get out in front of this and say, we don't want any more permanent members. Let's maybe create a new category of 7-year membership that could even be renewed or something. And that alone, if you had 5 governments elected to be on the council for 5 or 7 years, that would definitely, that's 5 minutes till I'm finished? For questions, oh my gosh. Okay, so let me get to, so this is the dilemma, but now I'm wanting to get to my summary, and I hope you will read the summary. If humanity is to survive the 21st century, fundamental improvements in the UN system and in other agencies of global governance must be established. Non-governmental organizations, educational institutions, and other components of civil society will be indispensable actors in effecting these changes. And I think it is self-explanatory, and I think all of the presenters have kind of endorsed this concept. The continued globalization of democracy, rule of law, justice, and human rights must be the foundations of the transition to a new world order. And there has been. If you look at how Freedom House would have judged governments who started the UN in 1945 at the end of World War II and throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, you've had a massive globalization of democracy in these last 69 years, 70 years, and a globalization of the rule of law and human rights and justice, in my mind. And enormous achievements in the General Assembly, the International Criminal Court, the Arms Trade Treaty, the Human Rights Council, the Responsibility to Protect, Peace Building Commission, etc. So I think there's a growing support for that. Mutual assured disarmament must replace mutual assured destruction. The fact that mutual assured destruction is still the primary defense policy of the nuclear powers should frighten all of us completely to death. And we have to find a way to get mutual assured disarmament. And I do believe that this 140-page agreement that 6 powers, including nuclear powers, adopted for Iran might be something they should apply to themselves. And we should all, as peace activists, be trying to say, write letters to the Labour Party leader in the UK that he's right. There's no reason why the UK shouldn't go ahead and complete nuclear disarmament for that. They would have no chance of survival if there's a nuclear war, and so it would be, I think, an extraordinarily important statement. The current UN cannot succeed. The balances of powers are not sustainable. However, the transition to the second or third generation international organization, from the second to a third generation international organization, must be legislative, not emerging from catastrophe and collapse. And this, I think, is something that our movement has not addressed properly, that there is, when I ran into Henry Kissinger and gave him this Einstein book in 1976 or 77, he said, oh, well, I agree, but, you know, it won't happen until after the next war. Well, it is madness, and the people in charge are crazy, and they need, and they don't know it. And you will see, this labor leader will be pushed out just because of this one issue now. And he's correct, and it has been correct. So the idea that maybe global warming kind of catastrophe could cause tipping points that would help, but I wouldn't bank on that either. I would be much more worried about what's going to happen with water and all of this. So my argument is, be very careful that you're going to rely on catastrophe or killing or shutting the existing UN down, and something better would replace it. My own view is the something better that would replace it would be World War III, or a G20 that would lead to World War III, or competing UNs in the North and the South, or something like that. Global governance myths need to be dispelled quickly. Mark was here today. The budget of Minnesota is $70 billion, I think, for 2 years, $35 billion a year. So the governor of Minnesota has 10 times more money than the Secretary General of the UN. In fact, he's got about what is the assessed funds for the entire UN system. It's around 44 billion or something, according to most recent figures. I'm from Wyoming. The governor of Wyoming has 50% more to spend than the Secretary General of the United Nations. We're not spending any funds relative to the cost, and one of the best chapters in Joe's book is on the funding issue. I would love to go into more of the myths, but I'm getting the hook. The emerging legal order will be a mosaic of regional and global laws and institutions, and that is, I think, one of the most important statements I want to make. That human rights is going to be governed at the global level and regional level and national level in different ways throughout the international legal order and world community. Human rights will be different from environment. That'll be different from peace and security, which will be different from justice. Criminal justice will be different from justice dealing with trade and financial regulation. Our environmental law enforcement, or the law of the sea enforcement. So what we have is a multi-dimensional mosaic that exists now in its, what I think will be its infancy, and it is going to be, this mosaic is going to be local to global. It's going to be different all over. It's not going to be this two-dimensional like we unfortunately constantly talk about. And to make that democratic and work, I think is another way of saying what Andy Knight was saying about the local up governance. So to me, in closing, the strategic coalitions of democracies from all regions working in concert with civil society coalitions will be a major model of reform. The subsidiarity principle that this is the first conference in a long time I've gone to where it's actually been raised 2 or 3 times is fundamental. And I'll say something also counterintuitive. As far as I've been concerned since 1970, the World Federalists are amongst the most conservative. Because the sooner the global community starts putting into place laws and institutions that can address global problems, the less there will be needed. The longer it's waited, the more catastrophic the issues they're responding to, the more dangerous and onerous those laws and institutions will become. And to close, the human race now knows that it has to make peace with itself if it's going to survive this century. The human race has to make peace with the rest of life on this planet, and we have to make peace with our planet. Thank you very much. Did I leave them any time for questions? Okay.
13 minutes.
All right.
Hi, Bill. Just a real practical question. I've always been amazed how you got that coalition together, you know, and how you convinced so many groups, just how you connected with them. Can you address that?
Well, quickly, I was a rock and roll department, a short-lived rock and roll department for Amnesty in 1987, 88, 89, and was able to get support from the Amnesty International's headquarters. And of course, they're an incredible global movement, and that alone helped bring some of the big groups into our thing. But the main was that the World Feds, we didn't have the expertise. What we wanted to do was to get the big groups, the international groups, to work with the regional groups and the national groups, and to keep it all going together. So ours was really a secretariat. We were servicing a consultative process. We were also experts on the accreditation processes for UN forums in the General Assembly, and that was an enormous advantage. So we knew how to use governments to help us get this political space that we needed to operate in. At the Rome conference, we would meet with, most delegations had 1 or 2 people from the smaller countries. A large country might have 5 or so. There might be 8 meetings going on at once, so no one could follow it. So we produced all of the newsletters, electronic and 2 daily print newsletters on what was happening. We held the press conferences to keep the media informed of what was going on. We worked with the countries in Arabic and French and Spanish and Swahili and other languages where we could translate and say, here's the main issues that the Committee of the Whole is going to be debating tomorrow, etc. And we were able to keep Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the International Federation for Human Rights, the parliamentarians groups, and others all working together. And we were like 300, so we were by far the largest delegation at the Rome conference. And the way we worked together, which was different from the past, and different from the way a lot of the groups work still today, environmental groups, they're all looking out for themselves and not working in strategic coalitions, et cetera. That is what helped us. Plus, we had this tipping point moment at the end of the Cold War where the small and mid-power democracies were willing to stand up and say we wanted a different legal basis. We did not want to continue just to create new ad hoc tribunals that the major powers in the Security Council would fight over and ended up being very corrupt. So,
Bill, question
Yes.
here. Would you say a word about the emerging advocacy opportunities coming up from the Commission on Global Security, Justice, and Governance?
Well, this is an important commission. The commission, I think, is a successor to the 1994 Commission on Global Governance that was headed out of the Swedish government, which crashed immediately because it called for getting rid of ECOSOC. And so this new commission, I think, has making some very important proposals, some of which I think are achievable. I think the whole idea of taking peace building up another level is absolutely a very good decision. I hope we can reconnect peace building to the responsibility to protect process also. So we'll be doing work internationally, and we know that Citizens for Global Solutions in the U.S. is going to be helping inform people about this important commission. Our president, Lloyd Axworthy, was on the commission. I think it was one of the very progressive forces on the commission, et cetera. So we'll look forward to working with them on that. I don't know how to.
Well, I have a
Okay,
microphone.
I think, yeah, getting the microphone will be the solution. So.
Given that you have pointed to a lot of problems in any of the solutions for enlarging permanent membership in the Security Council or changing the possibility of making decisions in the Security Council, do you think there's any future in the idea of going for a regular uniting for peace sort of action with the General Assembly if the General Assembly would be given weighted voting so that it would be taken seriously and the representation of the different governments would be proportional to the concepts that exist with weighted voting? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think the difference from 25 years ago to today is the vote in Rome 120 yes, 7 no would have been the other way around 30 years ago or so. So there's been a huge change. I think there's a group of small and middle democracies and emerging and wannabe democracies that cannot stand the failures of the Security Council in its maintenance of peace and security. And I hope when in trying to implement the 3 most recent studies on peace operations, peace architecture, and then on next week we'll have the new report on women, peace and security, the 1325 10-year report, that those governments will go forward and the General Assembly will begin to stand up to the Security Council because they fund all of it, so the General Assembly ought to, but they have been enormously unwilling to stand up to the United States, Russia, and China. They will stand up to the UK and France, but the UK and France have not used their veto in 25 years either, I mean, to their credit. But whether the membership of the General Assembly actually is willing to move on things like UNEPs, on really fundamentally strengthening the way the UN does peace operations. Right now, the developed countries outsource peacekeeping to the least developed countries who very often don't have the training, don't have the resources. So the failures of the Libya peace enforcement operation, et cetera, have never been addressed properly. So my hope is that between the General Assembly and the Security Council over these next 5 years, because this is 2015, let's have a 5-year program to 2020. That's something we advocated that the Global Commission embraced, and let's really look and see what was the deal on the charter to prevent World War III. We have prevented World War III. Einstein and Russell and them would be shocked that we're out 70 years and there hasn't been World War III without disarmament being achieved. But the deal with the permanent members and their veto, they haven't kept. And the rest of the international community, including civil society, has to force them, I think, to do it. The second point on this is the importance of developing strong regional international organizations. Those are the ones that are likely to do prevention much more effectively than the UN, which is prevented by the P5 and other forces from doing anything but catastrophic crisis reaction. Doing actual prevention is not something the major powers want a strong, independent UN to be able to do. So, yes.
First of all, I loved your conclusion about making peace with ourselves, with our fellow beings, and with the planet. Also, you're the convener of the Coalition on the International Criminal Court, and there's a fabulous film that Barry Stevens made about Luis Ocampo that's called Prosecutor. I know you've seen it, it's fabulous. What hope do you see in the International Criminal Court playing in terms of creating a workable world?
Well, again, the main hope of enforcing peace is that governments would respect the treaties that they've signed, the Geneva Conventions, the Human Rights Convention, et cetera. But they signed the treaties, then they would enforce them when it was in their self-interest and ignore them when it wasn't. Or if the president for life wanted it, who did it, it did. So what we're trying to do now is create transnational legal systems, which now encompasses 123 countries and covers most of the world. But the biggest, the United States is out, Russia's out, China's out, India's out, Pakistan, Indonesia. We still have massive populations that our governments aren't in. So we need to make it work with the small and mid-sized democracies, and remember that every time it gets involved with the Security Council on Libya and on Sudan, it gets itself in more trouble because they're not a reliable partner in this. But I do think the whole hope, and I understand Dr. Lerner, and I completely agree with his fears about the misuse of power, not only by the major powers, but by African leaders, Asian leaders, South American leaders, etc. But I do think creating a professional international peace force where I think Robert and we didn't agree maybe at the time of the drafting of the book. I know with Human Rights Watch and Global to Prevent War, I can't anyway. I thought that this rapid deployment force should be able to deal with not only man-made or international criminal humanitarian law disasters, but also natural disasters. I thought that if it was able to respond to massive earthquakes or floodings, etc., that it would be a good thing for a professional force at the UN to be able to do. So they say time is up. So thank you very much.